This is the CCS Noon Lecture Series, so if you think you're here for France, please leave. So I'm going to do some announcements, and I'm presenting a speaker today. On this coming Friday and Saturday, October 25th through 26th, the CCS Annual Conference Series will present an international conference on, quote, socialist culture in China reconsidered, close quote. It will be held in the Founders Room of the UM Alumni Center, and a program is available here today. The conference series is free and open to the public. Secondly, the next presentation in the CCS Noon Lecture Series will be given by Yuan Kang Wang, Associate Professor of Sociology, Western Michigan University, who will be speaking on international relations and Chinese history, the rise of Qing China. Thirdly, we would appreciate it if you would take a moment to turn off your cell phones before the talk begins. So today's presentation will be given by Nick Tackett, Associate Professor of History at UC Berkeley, and the associate thing came in, I think, last Thursday. So Professor Tackett, Professor Tackett received his PhD from Columbia University in 2006. After postdoctoral fellowships at the Getty Research Institute at Stanford University, he joined the UC Berkeley History Department in 2009. He has just completed a monograph on the destruction of the medieval Chinese aristocracy. He is now working on a second monograph that will look at how unusual social, political, and geopolitical factors during the 11th century spurred Chinese intellectuals into developing a new sense of their place in the world. Today he will be speaking on marriage networks and the geography of power in 9th century China. Please join me in welcoming him.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the nice introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased that so many people were able to attend my talk. So what I'm going to talk about then is I want to talk about the fundamental question that's really at the root of a book that I've just completed, which has to do with this idea of the demise of the medieval Chinese aristocracy. And my approach to that then is to look at these marriage networks as well as to the geographical distribution of political power. Okay, so by the middle of the Tang Dynasty, the great aristocratic families of medieval China, families that had dominated the bureaucracy and political life for generations, faced a number of existential challenges. Their decision to aggregate in the Tang capital cities over the course of the 6th and 7th centuries led them to lose control of provincial estates once critical to their long-term survival. The breakdown of the equal field system, which had once mandated the regular redistribution of land, and the deregulation of commerce in the wake of the catastrophic Anlushan rebellion of the mid-8th century, subsequently created an environment favorable to the development of new landed and commercial elites. Meanwhile, a series of institutional changes transformed how men obtained political office. Already at the time of the founding of the Sui dynasty, the aristocracy no longer remained a juridical category, as bureaucratic recruitment ceased explicitly to favor scions of the great aristocratic clans. By the turn of the 8th century, the civil service examination became a regularized, albeit still minor, recruitment tool for the bureaucracy, in principle providing some men of lowly background with an avenue of upward mobility. And a half-century later, new provincial bureaucracies were established that bypassed altogether the central government's recruitment procedures, offering, it has been argued, new opportunities for provincial elites to compete with the old aristocracy for political influence, and thus, according to these accounts, one had, by the 9th century, the signs of a newly risen elite that would come in later centuries to replace the old aristocracy. Now, basically, what I have found is that, in fact, so the standard narrative is what I've just given you, and you can see how this newly risen elite then would emerge in the 9th century. But remarkably, what I have found is that despite the set of radical economic and institutional transformations, the old aristocratic families survived almost unscathed until the final years of the Tang dynasty. They remained very influential at the highest levels of government, and this was already clear from David Johnson's work in the late 1970s, where he examined he was looking at the background of the chief ministers, that is the people at the very top of political power, and noticing that there was no substantial drop-off, maybe after the first decade of Tang rule, possibly, although that's probably more of a statistical anomaly. But by and large, if you look at the Tang dynasty and you consider these trends I talked about, there does not seem to be a remarkable decline, say, in the middle, after the middle of the 8th century at the time of the Anlushan rebellion. And then, as I shall show in a bit, they also, in fact, these same families essentially monopolized local and provincial office holding as well. So what I want to talk about then is, first I want to explain how they managed to adapt and survive economic and institutional change, which is precisely these changes I've been describing. How did they survive them and remain in power? And second, what ultimately did lead to their demise? And in the process, I will describe an alternative way of conceptualizing the Tang elite based on geography and on social networks that more accurately reflects the medieval Chinese political power structure. Now, when bringing up this issue of a new way of conceptualizing the elite, a new paradigm of how one thinks of the elite, one has to, and this I'm directing to graduate students in the room, it's important to have a new source material. It's actually quite unlikely that someone using the same material that has already existed will suddenly come up with a revolutionary new paradigm. If you do have a large amount of new source material, this does offer the possibility of building on the work of other people who have already come to some very interesting conclusions and contribute to this older scholarship and come up nevertheless with something new and interesting. So the source material I've been making use of are these tomb epitaphs. So just to give you a little background, these tomb epitaphs are essentially biographies, several hundred words in length, carved onto stone. Usually it's limestone. Then a cover is placed on top of the inscription, and the whole thing is then inserted into the tomb itself. So on the left you have the tomb. This is an underground chamber, and you can see the inscription there. So the inscription is here, and then the cover, you can just see a little corner of it, and it would presumably have been on top initially, and then the archaeologist removed it for the photograph. But this can give you some sense of what it looked like. And this means that you have these texts are very well preserved. When archaeologists excavate these tombs, they're in very good shape, these inscriptions. And the key point then is that hundreds, actually thousands of these have been excavated in the past few decades, many of which date to the 9th century, the final century of Tang rule, which, as you will see, is critical for what I'm talking about. Now, the tomb epitaphs are also interesting as a way of gaining new insight onto an older problem. They tend to dig deeper down into elite society. So whereas a prosopographic study of a few decades ago would have had to rely primarily on biographies and the standard histories, which covers really the top of the political elite, these inscriptions dig a little bit deeper down, and so you have a little bit more of an understanding, more context for understanding how the top of the political elite fit into a broader social landscape. Epitaphs are also cool because you can use them to localize elites. You know exactly where they are. You know the tombs, you know where the tombs were, and this gives you some sense of where the families that produced these inscriptions were based. The the more traditional historical scholarship makes it actually quite difficult to figure this out. And then finally, they're very good for reconstructing networks. They provide extensive genealogical information and also somewhat less, but nevertheless, some good information on marriage connections between families, which is also something that one tends not to have much info on from other source material. Now, the genealogical information from the epitaphs is, in fact, can be supplemented with with a substantial amount of material from more traditional sources, notably the New Tang History's genealogical table of chief ministers. And here it's important to note, and I think this is a key point, that the epitaphs more often than not, in fact, do corroborate the genealogical tables, allowing one to be relatively confident about both of these sources as a way of reconstructing genealogies. And so, in fact, for example, the genealogical table of chief ministers, with this, you can reconstruct some of these families, and I bring up the issue of the Zhaojun Li family, that is the Li family of Zhaojun. This was the topic that David Johnson focused on. And using these tables that were actually compiled in the 11th century, the New Tang History was written in the 11th century, so it's a later genealogy of an earlier period. There might be some room for being skeptical about the accuracy, but in fact, recently, archaeologists have discovered a set of tombs belonging to the Zhaojun Li, and this is really very recent. This was discovered as part of the canal that they're digging to bring water from the south to the north. This has been a great pre-modern historians love this canal because they're digging up all sorts of things all over the country. So they found these, and within this cemetery, they found tomb epitaphs that corroborate, by and large, these genealogical tables, and also demonstrate that this particular family was already intermarrying with another family that they were known to have been intermarrying with in later periods. There are some differences. For example, sometimes courtesy names. If you study Chinese studies, you would know courtesy names. It turns out sometimes courtesy names are used instead of taboo names, instead of the given names. So there's a few ways in which these different sources are switching around a little bit of information. But nevertheless, it's striking the degree to which everything lines up. Okay, so the net effect of all of this data is that I was able to compile a database that for this particular project contains 3,300 tomb epitaphs with information on 33,000 people. So there's a lot of people involved. You can reconstruct quite a bit from this. Now, I'll show you a little bit of some of these are in Chinese. I forgot to switch it. But anyways, I just want to say a little bit about the databases I've been constructing, so you have a little bit of sense of what can be done with this. This is kind of a parenthetical discussion, and then we'll return to the topic at hand in a second. So basically, it's a relational database, meaning it's a set of tables that are related to each other. So it's not just a single table, it's a table that's related to other tables. And this is key because this leads to a lot of things that you can do. So one of the tables is the people, and this is where you have 33,000 people in this table. Then you have a table of tomb epitaphs, and that's where you would have 3,000. And then there's also a table of relationships between people, right? So this is a standard approach for reconstructing networks of this sort. And this will give you a little bit of a sense of how this works. These are screenshots from the database. It's kind of clunky. I didn't spend too much time making pretty forms, but it works for our purposes. So basically, you would have here information from the table on tomb epitaphs, which will give you, among other things, some of the citation information on where you can find the text of these inscriptions. And then here's the relationship. You'll have some kind of number that links this element of the table to another table that has people in it. So this is sort of the key element of this relational database. And then you just start entering information. This was one does spend a lot of time doing this. So this is also, I don't know to what extent people in this room are attracted by digital methodologies. It is sort of a new thing. People are getting kind of excited about it, and some people do forget the amount of time involved. So I did calculate once that I spent a few years ago I calculated that I spent about 15,000 hours on this, and probably it's been more time since. So you do need to be, you need to know what you're getting into. But anyways, you can just take this information right out of these epitaphs. This is a rubbing of a fairly short epitaph, so the office appears in the title of the text, and then there's also some career information. And then, more interesting for my purposes is the genealogical information. It'll identify, for example, the father, the grandfather, and then the great-grandfather, and then you can stick that into the other database where you have people and their relationships. So the way I put it on these forms is I have the individual and then the father of the individual here. Anyways, just to give you a sense of how this works, I think you get the point. But you also then, the other key that I mentioned is that besides these relationships that allow the reconstruction of networks, you also have place information that allows you to get some sense of how geography, how the relationship between geography and political power. So now, what are some specific things you can do with this database? So one thing you can do then is, again, reconstruct these networks. And for those of you who, if anyone happens to be interested in reconstructing networks, this is the software I've been using, which is basically an Excel template. And it does crash occasionally, so you need a little bit of patience, but it produces good results. And it has this, what I consider to be a pretty cool algorithm, the Sugiyama algorithm, which just produces family trees. You just run this algorithm and bang, you have a nice family tree. So I would recommend this. And then the way, again, for anyone who is interested in the technical details, I believe that the object of what I'm doing is the historical research, not the technique itself, which means I do all sorts of hacks and things. If it works, then that's what I want it to do. So what I do actually is just, rather than linking the database to this, I just cut and paste, take a table, I create a table with access, and then cut and paste it into this Excel template, and then produce these very nice results. So I'll talk a little bit more about these family trees later on, but really you can quite easily create, visualize in a very nice way what's going on with these genealogies. Now I also mentioned that these epitaphs are important because they give you geographical information. They also give you insight onto elites in places that really don't get talked about in the standard historical texts, that in fact, as it turns out, what we learn from the standard sources is really focused on what's going on at the capital. And by the capital, for the purposes of the Tang Dynasty, I mean both Chang'an and Luoyang. There really were two capitals, and these two capitals and the region in between is I sort of refer to this as the capital. But it's interesting to see the distribution of these epitaphs. There is a concentration of epitaphs in the capital. So this is Luoyang, this is Chang'an, and this is this region that I call the capital corridor. That's the region between Chang'an and Luoyang. Then I have, but then you have other regions. I mentioned here the autonomous provinces of Hebei. That's in the late Tang, the northeast portion of the empire was essentially autonomous, and this is an interesting region in itself. And then here I just have other. But anyways, you get a sense that there's a pretty wide geographical distribution, so you have an ability using this to look at some geographic questions. Now, the other way you can look at geography is to look at place names mentioned within epitaphs. This is another way of looking at geography, and you can look at, for example, the places that people claimed as their place of family origin, and that's what's depicted here. I'm going to show another version of this in a little bit and explain more. But again, the point is that there's very interesting data to work with. Here's another example of what one can do. One can produce a table So this is showing where people died within the city of Chang'an. You can produce a table because epitaphs will typically tell you the ward in which they died in. That's typical information for the people who died in the capital. So you can produce just a list of everyone of a certain category, which ward they died in. You can count the numbers, and then you can copy that from your Access a database into an Excel spreadsheet, and then have the Excel spreadsheet automatically put the numbers on the map, and you can pretty rapidly see some interesting patterns. And I'll show an example of that in just a second. And then here, other things you can do with this type of data is you can then add additional tables, and this is a table of factions as reconstructed by Tanomi Mamoru. People have argued that there's some problems with this reconstruction of these factions, but it's still fun to just try it out. You can then find, so this is a typical way of using a relational database. You have a table of people, each person has a number, and then in order to reconstruct the factions, you just make a table where everyone of one faction is just listed by number. Everyone in another faction is listed either in a different table or in the same table but with a different number associated with it. And then you can, create some kind of cool charts reconstructing some of the factional networks, and this chart more or less showing that to the extent that they were factions, it was really among a small circle that the larger bureaucracy, or if you look at the bureaucracy at large, and then you see that these factional cores actually break down. But that's another issue. Anyways, I'm just giving you some sense of the possible things one can do. And I think we'll move on from here. I think I've given you enough. So now I want to move back to what I've actually done with this. And this is also directed to largely to graduate students. I've found that there are graduate students who are, again, excited about these digital methodology and then don't actually have anything to do with them. So it is worth then moving back and thinking, what can one actually do, practically speaking, in terms of answering historical questions. Okay, so now I'm moving back to the talk. Although there has been a tendency to identify members of the Tang socio-political elite on the basis of claims of descent from great clans, I have found in my research that, in fact, far too many individuals claimed such prestigious ancestries by the late Tang. For those of you who do study China, you'll know sort of how these great clans work. You have a surname and a place of origin. And if the place of origin is a prestigious place of origin for that surname, then this is a family that's being linked in the sources to one of these great families. And I gave the example of the Zhaojun Lis. That's the Li clan from Zhaojun, was precisely one of these eminent families. Now the problem is, it is very clear from the sources that people were getting prestige from claiming this ancestry. However, the problem is too many people were claiming it. And so here I have epitaphs from all over the country. And remember, well, I'm using epitaphs as essentially a way of getting a more or less random sample of the economic elite, the people who could afford more elaborate burials. And if you look at this this group of people all over the country, you find that a huge percentage of them claim descent from these great families. So this column lists basically, if you look at an epitaph, you look at the deceased, or his or her relatives by marriage, or other clan, people of the same clan, are they claiming descent from these great families? And you find that a huge percent are. So you have the sense that all over the country, all over the empire, there's a very large number of people claiming descent. So what does it mean if you have so many people? Clearly, one of the problems is that although great clan descent may have been necessary for high status in society, it was no longer a sufficient condition. Too many people were claiming it. Some of these claims might have been fictive, to be sure, but one should also remember that in the among Chinese elites of this period, because of the institution of concubinage and the fact that the offspring of concubines are considered legitimate offspring, it does mean that powerful families will have a lot of offspring. They will grow exponentially over time at a very high rate. And this helps to explain why, even though some of these claims might be fictive, they're also perfectly plausible. And you do have a sense that however you want to think about it, there's a lot of biological descendants of these families. So is it enough to simply argue that you are a descendant in order to actually have high status in society? And it's clearly not the case. It can't explain what's going on in the late Tang dynasty. And this is important because the way that the Tang elite has been measured, has been detected, is basically by looking for people who are descendants. And what I'm saying is that this is insufficient, that this is not going to tell you who is really has the power, that who really has power is just a subgroup of this much larger pool of descendants of great clans. Now, how then does one identify the members of this group? And I propose a couple of ways. First, one can define them strictly on the basis of geography, and I assume that anybody with an epitaph was a member of the wealthier strata of society. The corpus of extant epitaphs thus represents a random cross-section of the elite. I mentioned this. I also assume that the place of burial of an individual, as indicated in their tomb epitaph, can be equated with the family's home base, and I can give a little more evidence of this later, but I might skip it. If someone really wants to know, I can explain the rationale for that. Then, by systematically examining the large corpus of extant tomb epitaphs, it's possible, and this is important, to distinguish fundamental differences between capital-based elites, that is, individuals with tomb epitaphs buried in the capital region. Remember, that's the two capitals, Chang'an and Luoyang, and the region in between. And so there's a couple of ways in which they were fundamentally different. First, capital elites had a greater likelihood of having a family tradition of office holding, of a strong family tradition of office holding. I just define this sort of arbitrarily as more or less meaning the previous 3 generations all served in office, or at least I think I say 3 of the previous 4 or something like that for the strong tradition. Weak tradition just means occasional, there's evidence of office holding in this family, and no office holding means in the epitaph and all the information we have about this individual and this individual's family, we have no evidence of any office holding. So if you look at this, then you can see that indeed the capital region, these epitaphs tended to have a larger percentage of them were for people with family traditions of office holding, whereas in some other regions of China, there are far more epitaphs for people without a strong tradition. And again, if you're thinking about this pool of epitaphs as being the economic elite, it means that one could interpret this as a greater percentage of the economic elite were also political elites in the capital region. One can also look at then the types of office they held, and I divide this into exclusively national or exclusively local or mixed, basically meaning national is you serve in a central government position, or you serve or you're rotated to provincial posts all over the empire. Both of this I treat as a national, as what I call a national pattern of office holding, and then exclusively local means you only serve, like if your tomb is discovered in some county in provincial China, if you had served in government, you only served locally in some nearby administrative capacity. And again, you see a pretty sharp difference between this region, these first 3, which is the capital region, and some of these other regions, although the lower Yangtze is interesting, but I won't have time to get into that. Now, if you combine the two, if you combine this idea of a national pattern of office holding and of the strong office holding traditions, then you come up with a category that I term the national elite, and I love using some people who study the 20th century get upset because I use the word national, and I enjoy using it just for that reason. But anyways, you understand what I mean by national elite. I'm talking about, you can call it the empire-wide elite, except that doesn't sound very good. I think national elite sounds better. Anyways, this is the group that combines both of these categories, and then you see an even sharper distinction between the capital region and the rest of the empire, suggesting, I argue again, that there is a very sharp difference between elites, the elites in the capital region and the elites in the rest of the empire. There's a stark divide between the capital region and the rest of the empire, and we can see it quite clearly from this evidence. We can talk about this later. There's definitely no time now, but this is fundamentally different from what you have in the late imperial period, beginning with the Southern Song. The geography of power is very different. And so it's important to note what the situation is in the Tang so that you can then compare it to later periods if that is of interest. Okay. So now I've talked about the geography of power. The second way of defining the dominant socio-political elite involves reconstructing the elite's marriage network and then determining the members of the network. So I won't, for reasons of time, I won't spend too much time on this. I already showed you how to reconstruct these types of family trees. And what's interesting here, if one considers the geography, is that all of these circles represent epitaphs were found in Luoyang, so meaning they were buried in the Luoyang region. And this is interesting in itself to show how this large clan was all buried in one region, which is key. I'm arguing that if you find the epitaph for even a single member of one of these large family trees, it's likely that all members were actually based in that region, and this is good evidence for that. Even when they create branch cemeteries elsewhere, so here you have the Beimang Hills, and here you have Wanshan. So this is south of Luoyang, this is north of Luoyang. So you have people buried in different regions of the greater Luoyang area, but they all end up concentrated in one area, which again provides good evidence for this idea of linking their burials to where they were actually based. Anyways, once you've reconstructed enough of these, then you can produce another chart. Now this is, rather than being, so in this table, each dot is an individual, right? This is the standard family tree. In this one, each dot is a clan, meaning that in some sense this is a network of networks, right? And so here, this is how you can reconstruct then the marriage network between these different families based in the capital. And one indeed finds that there was intensive intermarrying between these powerful clans. This is not completely comprehensive due to the limitations of surviving data, but already the marriage network depicted in the diagram can be thought of as a visual representation of the dominant socio-political elite of the late Tang. This network was largely based in the capital, and you can, I've coded that with the shapes. So the circles are Luoyang, the triangles are Chang'an, and the square is either Luoyang or Chang'an or the capital region. So you can just see how all of these families are indeed based in the capital region. With a few exceptions. The network includes, according to my calculations, over 3/5. This network includes over 3/5 of known capital elites living in the 9th century, and I would imagine that if one gets more data, one would find even more connections suggesting that an even larger percentage of the capital elite was part of this network. Not surprisingly, the network was composed largely of branches of the great old families. Most patrilines can be shown to have held office nearly every generation since the Sui, that is the gray vertices on the diagram. So that means by the 9th century, so we're talking about the situation in the 9th century in this image, that most of these families The gray ones had already been basically serving in office for 300 years. The black squares, or the black shapes, are pre-sway, meaning these families, there's documentary evidence suggesting they were serving in office since even before the sway, so for more than 300 years. So these are people this is an entrenched elite that's been dominating political power for a very long time, and that's intermarrying very intensively with each other. Among the old families in this network, one can then analyze some of the subgroups using other color coding. So in this case, I just took the core of this network, and I'm identifying the so-called marriage ban clans. These are the clans that the emperor issued an edict in the 7th century forbidding them from intermarrying. The net effect, as you could imagine, is that they intermarried even more intensively and looked down on anyone who didn't want to intermarry with them. So you can see how one clique among this larger network is really essentially these marriage ban clans that are intermarrying intensively with each other. And then this network also included the imperial house. This is the imperial clan, actually. So if you're interested in these cliques, it's interesting that you have this one clique that's organized around these marriage ban families and another one that's organized around the imperial clan. Besides that, this network also includes a number of military families. These families tend to intermarry with the imperial clan, and also the families of the famous 9th century writers and poets, Du Mu, Bai Jui, Liao Zongyuan, Han Yu, Yuan Zhen. So a lot of the famous people we know about are part of this network that I showed you. You can find their family. You can demonstrate on the basis of extant genealogical information that they were part of one of these dots on this chart. Okay, so so now, using this methodology, it's possible to return to the question of social mobility in the late Tang. Did these various institutional changes I mentioned have an impact? And I've already suggested that they did not, on the basis of David Johnson's data, and I'll show a little more in a second. But then the question is, how did they maintain power despite this institutional innovation? And here you can then look at the people in the bureaucracy who had the most say after these institutional innovations in the reproduction of the bureaucracy. And I think this is obvious. I won't go into detail for reasons of time, but the people who were most important for the reproduction of the bureaucracy, that is, for selecting the next generation of bureaucrats, were the chief ministers, the chief examiners, that is, the people who in charge of the civil service examinations, and also the ministers of personnel. And here you can look at these two categories that I talked about as a way of defining the dominant political elite, one based on geography, one based on the participation in this network that I displayed in an earlier slide. And you can see that a very large percentage of all of these were either based in the capital. So, so I take each of these, for example, chief ministers, I link them up to a family tree. I figured out where that family is buried, and then I determine that basically there's no evidence of any of them being from families outside of the capital region by the 9th century. And this was true of the chief ministers, the chief examiners, and the ministers of personnel. And then this network that I diagrammed, it's the same thing. A very large percentage of them, 76 out of 103 had known ties to this network, and then similarly high percentages elsewhere. And here it's important to note this thing about known ties. We are dealing ultimately with fragmentary data, right? All of this data from this period is fragmentary, and one has to be careful of applying the methods of social scientists, sociologists say, who do have access to more comprehensive data. It's just the luck of the draw, what we get. What can you do with fragmentary data, and what do you do with these known ties? One has to not assume that this meant they were not part of this network. One has to assume maybe they were, and we just haven't demonstrated it yet. Okay, so this is some of these bureaucratic developments. The other important institutional innovation are these provincial governments. So there's a extensive scholarship on how these provincial governments existed as a parallel bureaucracy in the post-An Lushan period, so beginning in the late 8th century and into the 9th century. And the idea then is that they were, this was a source of upward mobility. People joined were able to join these sort of parallel bureaucracies even if they weren't from the entrenched elite. In fact, I have evidence that this is not true at all. These various shaded areas are provincial governors who have known ties to the capital and or the capital network. And again, if you consider that some of these blanks mean nothing at all, it's just the nature of the fragmentary data, it's quite striking the degree to which these provincial governors were very much part of this entrenched elite. You can also look at the distribution, or if you look at the epitaphs again, you can find evidence that among people buried in the capital region, when they served in provincial governments, they tended overwhelmingly to serve in the upper echelon civilian positions, whereas when you find epitaphs in the provinces and you find people who served in these provincial governments, they tended never actually to serve in the upper echelon civilian positions. It was only the upper echelon civilian positions where you actually could get promoted into the regular bureaucracy. So here again, you're seeing how this capital elite is co-opting the second avenue of upward mobility. One is the civil service examination and the regular bureaucracy. The other is these provincial bureaucracies. These guys figured out how to work the system to their advantage, which again explains why they survived and why they did not. There was no significant newly risen elite as of the 9th century. The question then, and I'll summarize it in a couple of minutes, is how do you explain the sudden demise? And there was a sudden demise of these great families, but it did not happen after the An Lushan rebellion in the mid-8th century, as is often argued. It happened after the Huangchao rebellion at the end of the 9th century. This rebellion, as it turns out, was much, much more violent than the An Lushan rebellion. It's kind of amuses me because there was a recent book on the history of violence that has labeled the An Lushan rebellion. If you calibrate it towards the population of the world at the time, it stated the An Lushan rebellion was the most violent conflict of human history. And I can tell you it was not as violent as the Huangchao rebellion. If you just look at the impact on society, this is an interesting way of doing it, is just to look at the total number of excavated epitaphs, which plummets after the Huangchao rebellion and just kind of drops off and never recovers until late in the 11th century. The joke among demographers is that this proves that people stopped dying after the Huangchao rebellion. That's not the case. What this proves is that people, this elite that was where these epitaphs played a very important part of their culture, they just disappeared after this point. There was a drop-off after the An Lushan, but if you don't consider this kind of peak right here just before the An Lushan rebellion, and you consider this as some sort of baseline, they almost recovered by the 9th century to a baseline sort of like this in terms of the total number of these objects produced by this elite culture, but they plummeted after the Huangchao. There's also some information. One of the ways of assessing the greater violence of the Huangchao this is kind of impressionistic, but I basically counted the number of battles that are supposedly had 10,000 people or more died. This is, of course, impressionistic. These numbers, who knows what these numbers mean? But it's nevertheless interesting that there's far more of these incidents after the 880s than after the 750s. And moreover, you can see that after the Huangchao rebellion, this was happening all over the empire, not just in the northeast, which was the basis of which was sort of the core of the An Lushan rebellion. So the ways these rebellions differed then is Huangchao was larger in geographic scope, more people were killed, and also the post-Huangchao period lasted longer. There was extreme violence for several decades, which meant that even people who had survived one massacre would not necessarily survive the next one. It's interesting when you look at the examples of survivors, because of course there were survivors. You can read what the survivors say. And very often, if you look at their own life histories, it involved moving around a lot during this period and basically getting lucky. They happened not to be in this town during that massacre, to be in that town, and they happened to be back in this town when the massacre happened in that town. They were moving around, they got lucky. And there's some interesting accounts of the luck, and it's too bad I don't have time to go through this, but it will be in my book. But there's these nice accounts of basically the luck of the draw of you happen to survive, you happen not to survive. So there was, for example, here, you just have a sense, this is a poem written as he's trying to flee the violence, and he sees people heading upriver, and then in the evening their corpses are floating down. I think this is a nice articulation of this idea. It's like, oops, went the wrong way. Should have gone that way, shouldn't have gone this way. The last point I want to make is, again, I think that there were survivors, and the story of the survivors is another story. I'm going to deal with that in a next project. But what I think is interesting is, again, this network was able to dominate the political world, partly because of how concentrated it was in one region, and how much they dominated all of these elements of the bureaucracy in order to maintain them in power. Even though there were some survivors, it seems quite clear that the networks broke down, so that the survivors were now no longer had this network to turn to. They didn't have the connections needed to maintain themselves in power, and I think this helps to account for this dramatic decline. This can also explain a cultural shift, but that's also another story. I'm not going to talk about the culture at this point. But there's some nice poems that I think represent the sense of a breakdown of a network where this guy, he finds, I parted from you 15 years ago. When we parted, the world had not yet fallen into chaos. In this period of upheaval, what joy that we are both still alive. Can one bear to hear once more about who is living and who is dead? This idea that during this time period, you're talking to people and everyone's dead. Everyone has died. I think that this gives you some sense. I read this as an illustration of this idea of a complete collapse of a social network, and beginning of another era. Anyways, I'll stop here. I think good time to stop.